Tragedy and Hope. Chapter 5. The First World War, 1914 to 1918. The Growth of International Tensions, 1871 to 1914. Introduction. The unification of Germany in the decade before 1871 ended a balance of power in Europe which had existed for 250 or even 300 years. During this long period, covering almost 10 generations, Britain had been relatively secure and of growing power. She had found this power challenged only by the states of Western Europe. Such a challenge had come from Spain under Philip II, from France under Louis XIV and under Napoleon, and, in an economic sense, from the Netherlands during much of the 17th century. Such a challenge could arise because these states were as rich and almost as unified as Britain herself. But, above all, it could arise because the nations of the West could face seaward and challenge England so long as Central Europe was disunited and economically backward. The unification of Germany by Bismarck destroyed this situation politically, while the rapid economic growth of that country after 1871 modified the situation economically. For a long time, Britain did not see this change, but rather tended to welcome the rise of Germany, because it relieved her, to a great extent, from the pressure of France in the political and colonial fields. This failure to see the changed situation continued until after 1890, because of Bismarck's diplomatic genius, and because of the general failure of non-Germans to appreciate the marvelous organizing ability of the Germans in industrial activities. After 1890, Bismarck's masterful grip on the tiller was replaced by the vacillating hands of Kaiser William II and a succession of puppet chancellors. These incompetents alarmed and alienated Britain by challenging her in commercial, colonial, and especially naval affairs. In commercial matters, the British found German salesmen and their agents offering better service, better terms, and lower prices on goods of at least equal quality, and in metric rather than Anglo-Saxon sizes and measurements. In the colonial field, after 1884, Germany acquired African colonies, which threatened to cut across the continent from east to west, and thus checkmate the British ambitions to build a railway from the Cape of Good Hope to Cairo. These colonies included East Africa, Tanganyika, Southwest Africa, Cameroons, and Togo. The German threat became greater as a result of German intrigues in the Portuguese colonies of Angola and Mozambique, and above all by the German encouragement of the Boers of the Transvaal and the Orange Free State before their war with Britain in 1899 to 1902. In the Pacific area, Germany acquired by 1902 the Caroline, Marshall, and Marinas Islands, part of the New Guinea and Samoa, and a base of naval and commercial importance at Kai Chau on the Shantung Peninsula of China. In naval affairs, Germany presented her greatest threat as a result of the German naval bills of 1898, 1900, and 1902, which were designed to be an instrument of coercion against Britain. 14 German battleships were launched between 1900 and 1905. As a consequence of these activities, Britain joined the anti-German coalition by 1907. The powers of Europe became divided into two antagonistic coalitions, and a series of crises began, which led, step by step, to the catastrophe of 1914. International affairs in the period 1871 to 1914 can be examined under four headings. 1. The creation of the Triple Alliance, 1871 to 1890. 2. The creation of the Triple Entente, 1890 to 1907. 3. The efforts to bridge the gap between the two coalitions, 1890 to 1914. And 4. The series of international crises, 1905 to 1914. These are the headings under which we shall examine this subject. The creation of the Triple Alliance, 1871 to 1890. The establishment of a German empire dominated by the Kingdom of Prussia left Bismarck politically satisfied. He had no desire to annex any additional Germans to the new empire, and the growing ambitions for colonies and a worldwide empire left him cold. As a satisfied diplomat, he concentrated on keeping what he had, and realized that France, driven by fear and vengeance, was the chief threat to the situation. His immediate aim, accordingly, was to keep France isolated. This involved the more positive aim to keep Germany in friendly relations with Russia and the Habsburg Empire, and to keep Britain friendly by abstaining from colonial or naval adventures. As part of this policy, Bismarck made two tripartite agreements with Russia and Austro-Hungary: A, the Three Emperors League of 1873, and B, the Three Emperors Alliance of 1881. Both of these were disrupted by the rivalry between Austria and Russia in southeastern Europe, especially in Bulgaria. The Three Emperors League broke down in 1878 at the Congress of Berlin because of Habsburg opposition to Russia's effort to create a great satellite state in Bulgaria after her victory in the Russo-Turkish War of 1877. The Three Emperors Alliance of 1881 broke down in the Bulgarian crisis of 1885. This crisis arose over the Bulgarian annexation of eastern Rumelia, a union which was opposed by Russia but favored by Austria, thus reversing the attitude these powers had displayed at Berlin in 1878. The rivalry between Russia and Austria in the Balkans made it clear to Bismarck that his efforts to form a diplomatic front of the three great empires were based on weak foundations. Accordingly, he made a second string for his bow. It was this second string which became the Triple Alliance. Forced to choose between Austria and Russia, Bismarck took the former because it was weaker and thus easier to control. He made an Austro-German alliance in 1879, following the disruption of the Three Emperors League, and in 1882 expanded it into a triple alliance of Germany, Austria, and Italy. This alliance, originally made for 5 years, was renewed at intervals until 1915. After the disruption of the Three Emperors Alliance in 1885, the Triple Alliance became the chief weapon in Germany's diplomatic armory. Although Bismarck, in order to keep France isolated, refused to permit Russia to drift completely out of the German sphere, and tried to bind Germany and Russia together by a secret agreement of friendship and neutrality, known as the Reassurance Treaty of 1887. This treaty, which ran for 3 years, was not renewed in 1890, after the new emperor, William II, had discharged Bismarck. The Kaiser argued that the Reassurance Treaty with Russia was not compatible with the Triple Alliance with Austria and Italy, since Austria and Russia were so unfriendly. By failing to renew, William left Russia and France both isolated. From this condition, they naturally moved together to form the Dual Alliance of 1894. Subsequently, by antagonizing Britain, the German government helped to transform this dual alliance into the Triple Entente. Some of the reasons why Germany made these errors will be examined in a subsequent chapter on Germany's internal history. The creation of the Triple Entente, 1890 to 1907. The diplomatic isolation of Russia and France combined with a number of more positive factors to bring about the Dual Alliance of 1894. Russian antagonism toward Austria in the Balkans and French fear of Germany along the Rhine were increased by Germany's refusal to renew the Reassurance Treaty and by the early renewal of the Triple Alliance in 1891. Both powers were alarmed by growing signs of Anglo-German friendship at the time of the Heligoland Treaty, 1890, and on the occasion of the Kaiser's visit to London in 1891. Finally, Russia needed foreign loans for railroad building and industrial construction, and these could be obtained most readily in Paris. Accordingly, the agreement was closed during the New Year celebrations of 1894 in the form of a military convention. This provided that Russia would attack Germany if France were attacked by Germany or by Italy supported by Germany, while France would attack Germany if Russia were attacked by Germany or by Austria supported by Germany. This dual alliance of France and Russia became the base of a triangle, whose other sides were ententes, that is, friendly agreements between France and Britain, 1904, and between Russia and Britain, 1907. To us looking back on it, the Entente cordiale between France and Britain seems inevitable. Yet, to contemporaries, as late as 1898, it must have appeared as a most unlikely event. For many years, Britain had followed a policy of diplomatic isolation, maintaining a balance of power on the continent by shifting her own weight to whatever side of Europe's disputes seemed the weaker. Because of her colonial rivalries with France in Africa and Southwest Asia, and her disputes with Russia in the Near, Middle, and Far East, Britain was generally friendly to the Triple Alliance and estranged from the Dual Alliance as late as 1902. Her difficulties with the Boers in South Africa, the growing strength of Russia in the Near and Far East, and Germany's obvious sympathy with the Boers led Britain to conclude the Anglo-Japanese Alliance of 1902 in order to obtain support against Russia and China. About the same time, Britain became convinced of the need and the possibility of an agreement with France. The need arose from Germany's direct threat to Britain's most sensitive spot by Tirpitz's naval building program of 1898. The possibility of agreement with France emerged in the wake of the most acute Anglo-French crisis of modern times, the Fashoda crisis of 1898. At Fashoda, on the Nile, a band of French under Colonel Jean Marchand, who had been crossing the Sahara from west to east, came face to face with a force of British under General Kitchener, who had been moving up the Nile from Egypt in order to subdue the tribes of the Sudan. Each ordered the other to withdraw. Passions rose to fever heat while both sides consulted their capitals for instructions. As a consequence of these instructions, the French withdrew. As passions cooled and the dust settled, it became clear to both sides that their interests were reconcilable, since France's primary interest was on the continent, where she faced Germany, while Britain's primary interest was in the colonial field, where she increasingly found herself facing Germany. France's refusal to engage in colonial war with Britain while the German army sat across the Rhine made it clear that France could arrive at a colonial agreement with Britain. This agreement was made in 1904 by putting all their disputes together on the negotiation table and balancing one against another. The French recognized the British occupation of Egypt in return for diplomatic support for their ambitions in Morocco. They gave up ancient rights to Newfoundland in return for new territories in Gabon and along the Niger River in Africa. Their rights in Madagascar were recognized in return for accepting a British sphere of interests in Siam. Thus, the ancient Anglo-French enmity was toned down in the face of the rising power of Germany. This Entente cordiale was deepened in the period 1906 to 1914 by a series of Anglo-French military conversations, providing at first for unofficial discussions regarding behavior in a quite hypothetical war with Germany, but hardening imperceptibly through the years into a morally binding agreement for a British expeditionary force to cover the French left wing in the event of a French war with Germany. These military conversations were broadened after 1912 by a naval agreement by which the British undertook to protect France from the North Sea in order to free the French fleet for action against the Italian Navy in the Mediterranean. The British agreement with Russia in 1907 followed a course not dissimilar to that of the British agreement with France in 1904. British suspicions of Russia had been fed for years by their rivalry in the Near East. By 1904, these suspicions were deepened by a growing Anglo-Russian rivalry in Manchuria and North China, and were brought to a head by Russian construction of the Trans-Siberian Railway, finished in 1905. A violent crisis arose over the Dogger Bank incident of 1904, when the Russian fleet, en route from the Baltic Sea to the Far East, fired on British fishing vessels in the North Sea in the belief that they were Japanese torpedo boats. The subsequent destruction of that Russian fleet by the Japanese and the ensuing victory of Britain's ally in the Russo-Japanese War of 1905 made clear to both parties that agreement between them was possible. German naval rivalry with Britain and the curtailment of Russian ambitions in Asia as a result of the defeat by Japan made possible the agreement of 1907. By this agreement, Persia was divided into 3 zones of influence, of which the northern was Russian, the southern was British, and the center was neutral. Afghanistan was recognized as under British influence. Tibet was declared to be under Chinese suzerainty, and Britain expressed her willingness to modify the Straits Agreements in a direction favorable to Russia. One influence which worked to create and strengthen the Triple Entente was that of the international banking fraternity. These were largely excluded from the German economic development, but had growing links with France and Russia. Prosperous enterprises like the Suez Canal Company, the Rothschild Copper Enterprise, Rio Tinto in Spain, and many newer joint activities in Morocco created numerous unobtrusive links which both preceded and strengthened the Triple Entente. The Rothschilds, close friends of Edward VII and of France, were linked to the French investment bank, Banque du Paris et du Pays-Bas. This, in turn, was the chief influence in selling 9 billion rubles of Russian bonds in France before 1914. The most influential of London bankers, Sir Ernest Cassell, a great and mysterious person, 1852 to 1921, had come from Germany to England at the age of 17, built up an immense fortune which he gave away with a lavish hand, was closely connected with Egypt, Sweden, New York, Paris, and Latin America, became one of King Edward's closest personal friends and employer of the greatest wire puller of the period, the ubiquitous mole Lord Esher. These generally anti-Prussian influences around King Edward played a significant part in building up the Triple Entente and in strengthening it when Germany foolishly challenged their projects in Morocco in the 1904 to 1912 period. Efforts to bridge the gap between the two coalitions, 1890 to 1914. At the beginning, and even up to 1913, the two coalitions on the international scene were not rigid or irreconcilably alienated. The links between the members of each group were variable and ambiguous. The Triple Entente was called an Entente just because two of its three links were not alliances. The Triple Alliance was by no means solid, especially in respect to Italy, which had joined it originally to obtain support against the papacy over the Roman question, but which soon tried to obtain support for an aggressive Italian policy in the Mediterranean and North Africa. Failure to obtain specific German support in these areas and continued enmity with Austro-Hungary in the Adriatic made the Italian link with the Central Powers rather tenuous. We shall mention at least a dozen efforts to bridge the gap which was slowly forming in the European concert of powers. First in chronological order were the Mediterranean Agreements of 1887. In a series of notes, England, Italy, Austria, and Spain agreed to preserve the status quo in the Mediterranean and its adjoining seas, or to see it modified only by mutual agreement. These agreements were aimed at the French ambitions in Morocco and the Russian ambitions at the Straits. A second agreement was the Anglo-German Colonial Treaty of 1890, by which German claims in East Africa, especially Zanzibar, were exchanged for the British title of the island of Heligoland in the Baltic Sea. Subsequently, numerous abortive efforts were made by the Kaiser and others on the German side, and by Joseph Chamberlain and others on the British side, to reach some agreement for a common front in world affairs. This resulted in a few minor agreements, such as one of 1898 regarding a possible disposition of the Portuguese colonies in Africa, one of 1899 dividing Samoa, and one of 1900 to maintain the open door in China. But efforts to create an alliance, or even an Entente, broke down over the German naval program, German colonial ambitions in Africa, especially Morocco, and German economic penetration of the Near East along the route of the Berlin to Baghdad Railway. German jealousy of England's world supremacy, especially the Kaiser's resentment toward his uncle, King Edward VII, was ill-concealed. Somewhat similar negotiations were conducted between Germany and Russia, but with meager results. A commercial agreement of 1894 ended a long-drawn tariff war, much to the chagrin of the German landlords, who enjoyed the previous exclusion of Russian grain, but efforts to achieve any substantial political agreement failed because of the German alliance with Austria, which faced Russia in the Balkans, and the Russian alliance with France, which faced Germany along the Rhine. These obstacles wrecked the so-called Bajorko Treaty, a personal agreement between the Kaiser and Nicholas made during a visit to each other's yachts in 1905. Although the Germans were able to secure Russian consent to the Baghdad Railway by granting the Russians a free hand in northern Persia, 1910. 4 other lines of negotiation arose out of the French ambitions to obtain Morocco, the Italian desire to get Tripoli, the Austrian ambition to annex Bosnia, and the Russian determination to open the straits to their warships. All 4 of these were associated with the declining power of Turkey and offered opportunities for the European powers to support one another's ambitions at the expense of the Ottoman Empire. In 1898, Italy signed a commercial treaty with France, and followed this up, 2 years later, by a political agreement which promised French support for the Italian ambitions in Tripoli, in return for Italian support for the French designs in Morocco. The Italians further weakened the Triple Alliance in 1902 by promising France to return to neutral in the event that France was attacked or had to fight in defense of her honor or of her security. In a somewhat similar fashion, Russia and Austria tried to reconcile the former's desire to obtain an outlet through the Dardanelles into the Aegean with the latter's desire to control Slav nationalism in the Balkans and reach the Aegean at Saloniki. In 1897, they reached an agreement to maintain the status quo in the Balkans, or, failing this, to partition the area among the existing Balkan states, plus a new state of Albania. In 1903, these two powers agreed on a program of police and financial reform for the disturbed Turkish province of Macedonia. In 1908, a disagreement over Austrian efforts to construct a railway toward Saloniki was glossed over briefly by an informal agreement between the respective foreign ministers, Alexander Isfolisky and Lexa von Erhenthal, to exchange Austrian approval of the right of Russian warships to traverse the straits for Russian approval of an Austrian annexation of the Turkish provinces of Bosnia and Herzegovina. All this tentative goodwill evaporated in the heat of the Bosnian crisis of 1908, as we shall see in a moment. After 1905, the recurrent international crisis and the growing solidarity of the coalitions, except for Italy, made the efforts to bridge the gap between the two coalitions less frequent and less fruitful. However, two episodes are worthy of attention. These are the Haldane Mission of 1912 and the Baghdad Railway Agreement of 1914. In the former, British Secretary of State for War Lord Haldane went to Berlin to try to restrain Tirpitz's naval program. Although the German Navy had been built in the hope that it would bring England to the conference table, and without any real intention of using it in a war with England, the Germans were not able to grasp the opportunity when it occurred. The Germans wanted a conditional promise of British neutrality in a continental war as a price for suspension of the new naval bill. Since this might lead to German hegemony on the continent, Haldane could not agree. He returned to London convinced that the Germany of Goethe and Hegel, which he had learned to love in his student days, was being swallowed up by the German militarists. The last bridge between London and Berlin seemed down, but in June 1914, the two countries initialed the agreement by which Britain withdrew her opposition to the Baghdad Railway, in return for a German promise to remain north of Basra and recognize Britain's preeminence on the Euphrates and Persian Gulf. This solution to a long-standing problem was lost in the outbreak of war 6 weeks later. The International Crises, 1905 to 1914. The decade from the Entente Cordiale to the outbreak of war witnessed a series of political crises which brought Europe periodically to the brink of war and hastened the growth of armaments. Popular hysteria, nationalistic chauvinism, and solidarity of alliances to a point where a relatively minor event in 1914 plunged the world into a war of unprecedented range and intensity. There were 9 of these crises which must be mentioned here. In chronological order, they are 1905 to 1906, the First Moroccan Crisis and the Algeciras Conference, 1908, the Bosnian Crisis, 1911, Agadir and the Second Moroccan Crisis, 1911, the Tripolitan War, 1912, the First Balkan War, 1913, the Second Balkan War, 1913, the Albanian Crisis, 1913, the Lyman von Sanders Affair, 1914, Sarajevo. The First Moroccan Crisis arose from German opposition to French designs on Morocco. This opposition was voiced by the Kaiser himself in a speech in Tangier, after the French had won Italian, British, and Spanish acquiescence by secret agreements with each of these countries. These agreements were based on French willingness to yield Tripoli to Italy, Egypt to Britain, and the Moroccan coast to Spain. The Germans insisted on an international conference in the hope that their belligerents would disrupt the Triple Entente and isolate France. Instead, when the conference met at Algeciras, near Gibraltar, in 1906, Germany found herself supported only by Austria. The conference reiterated the integrity of Morocco, but set up a state bank and a police force, both dominated by French influence. The crisis reached a very high pitch, but in both France and Germany, the leaders of the more belligerent bloc, Théophile Delcasse and Friedrich von Holstein, were removed from office at the critical moment. The Bosnian crisis of 1908 arose from the Young Turk revolt of the same year. Fearful that the new Ottoman government might be able to strengthen the empire, Austria determined to lose no time in annexing Bosnia and Herzegovina, which had been under Austrian military occupation since the Congress of Berlin, 1878. Since the annexation would permanently cut Serbia off from the Adriatic Sea, Ahrendthal, the Austrian foreign minister, consulted with Serbia's protector, Russia. The Tsar's foreign minister, Izvolsky, was agreeable to the Austrian plan if Austria would yield to Izvolsky's desire to open the straits to Russian warships, contrary to the Congress of Berlin. Ahrendthal agreed, subject to Izvolsky's success in obtaining the consent of the other powers. While Izvolsky was wending his way from Germany to Rome and Paris in an effort to obtain this consent, Ahrendthal suddenly annexed the two districts, leaving Izvolsky without his Straits program. October 6, 1908. It soon became clear that he could not get this program. About the same time, Austria won Turkish consent to its annexation of Bosnia. A war crisis ensued, fanned by the refusal of Serbia to accept the annexation and its readiness to participate in a general war to prevent it. The danger of such a war was intensified by the eagerness of the military group in Austria, led by Chief of Staff Konrad von Hötzendorf, to settle the Serb irritation once and for all. A stiff German note to Russia insisting that she abandon her support of Serbia and recognize the annexation cleared the air. For Izvolsky yielded and Serbia followed, but it created a very bad psychological situation for the future. The Second Moroccan Crisis arose, July 1911, when the Germans sent a gunboat, the Panther, to Agadir in order to force the French to evacuate Fez, which they had occupied, in violation of the Algeciras Agreement, in order to suppress native disorders. The crisis became acute, but subsided when the Germans gave up their opposition to French plans in Morocco in return for the cession of French territory in the Congo area, November 4, 1911. As soon as Italy saw the French success in Morocco, it seized neighboring Tripoli, leading to the Tripolitan War between Italy and Turkey, September 28, 1911. All the great powers had agreements with Italy not to oppose her acquisition of Tripoli, but they disapproved of her methods and were alarmed to varying degrees by her conquest of the Dodecanese Islands, the Aegean, and her bombardment of the Dardanelles, April 1912. The Balkan states decided to profit from the weakness of Turkey by driving her out of Europe completely. Accordingly, Serbia, Bulgaria, Greece, and Montenegro attacked Turkey in the First Balkan War and had considerable success, 1912. The Triple Alliance opposed the Serbian advance to the Adriatic and suggested the creation of a new state in Albania to keep Serbia from the sea. A brief war crisis died down when Russia again abandoned the Serbian territorial claims and Austria was able to force Serbia and Montenegro to withdraw from Durazzo and Suktaria. By the Treaty of London, 1913, Turkey gave up most of her territory in Europe. Serbia, embittered by her failure to obtain the Adriatic coast, attempted to find compensation in Macedonia at the expense of Bulgaria's gains from Turkey. This led to the Second Balkan War, in which Serbia, Greece, Romania, and Turkey attacked Bulgaria. By the ensuing treaties of Bucharest and Constantinople, August through September 1913, Bulgaria lost most of Macedonia to Serbia and Greece, much of Dobruja to Romania, and parts of Thrace to Turkey. Embittered at the Slavs and their supporters, Bulgaria drifted rapidly toward the Triple Alliance. Ultimatums from Austria and Italy jointly, October 1913, forced Serbia and Greece to evacuate Albania, and made it possible to organize that country within frontiers agreeable to the Conference of Ambassadors at London. This episode hardly had time to develop into a crisis when it was eclipsed by the Lyman von Sanders affair. Lyman von Sanders was the head of a German military mission invited to the Ottoman Empire to reorganize the Turkish army. an obvious necessity in view of its record in the Balkan Wars. When it became clear that Lyman was to be actual commander of the First Army Corps at Constantinople and practically chief of staff in Turkey, Russia and France protested violently. The crisis subsided in January 1914, when Lyman gave up his command at Constantinople to become Inspector General of the Turkish Army. The series of crises from April 1911 to January 1914 had been almost uninterrupted. The spring of 1914, on the contrary, was a period of relative peace and calm, on the surface at least. But appearances were misleading. Beneath the surface, each power was working to consolidate its own strength and its links with its allies in order to ensure that it would have better, or at least no worse, success in the next crisis, which everyone knew was bound to come. And come it did, with shattering suddenness, when the heir to the Habsburg throne, Archduke Francis Ferdinand, was assassinated by Serb extremists in the Bosnian city of Sarajevo on the 28th of June, 1914. There followed a terrible month of fear, indecision, and hysteria before the World War was begun by an Austrian attack on Serbia on July 28, 1914. Whole volumes have been written on the crisis of July 1914, and it is hardly to be expected that the story could be told in a few paragraphs. The facts themselves are woven into a tangled skein, which historians have now unraveled. But more important than the facts, and considerably more elusive, are the psychological conditions surrounding these facts. The atmosphere of nervous exhaustion after 10 years of crisis, the physical exhaustion from sleepless nights, the alternating moods of patriotic pride and cold fear, the underlying feeling of horror that 19th century optimism and progress were leading to such a disaster, the brief moments of impatient rage at the enemy for starting the whole thing, the nervous determination to avoid war if possible, but not to be caught off guard when it came, and, if possible, to catch your opponent off guard instead. And, finally, the deep conviction that the whole experience was only a nightmare, and that at the last moment some power would stop it. These were the sentiments which surged to and fro in the minds of millions of Europeans in those 5 long weeks of mounting tension. A number of forces made the crises of the period before the outbreak of war more dangerous than they would have been a generation or so earlier. Among these, we should mention the influence of the mass army, the influence of the alliance system, the influence of democracy, the effort to obtain diplomatic ends by intimidation, the mood of desperation among politicians, and, lastly, the increasing influence of imperialism. The influence of the mass army will be discussed more extensively in the next chapter. Briefly, the mass army, in a period in which communication was generally by telegraph and travel was by rail, was an unwieldy thing, which could be handled only in a rather rigid and inflexible fashion. As worked out by the Germans and used with such success in 1866 and in 1870, this fashion required the creation, long before the war began, of detailed plans executed in sequence from an original signal and organized in such a way that every single person had a fixed role, like a part in a great and intricate machine. As used by the Germans in early wars, extended by them and copied by others in the period before 1914, each soldier began to move from his home at a given signal. As they advanced, hour by hour and day by day, these men assembled their equipment and organized into larger and larger groups, at first in platoons, companies, and regiments, then in divisions and armies. As they assembled, they were advancing along lines of strategic attack made long before, and, as likely as not, the convergence into armies would not be accomplished until the advance had already penetrated deep into enemy territory. As formulated in theory, the final assembly into a complete fighting machine would take place only a brief period before the whole mass hurled itself on an, as yet, only partially assembled enemy force. The great drawback to this plan of mobilization was its inflexibility and its complexity, these two qualities being so preponderant that, once the original signal was given, it was almost impossible to stop the forward thrust of the whole assemblage anywhere short of its decisive impact on the enemy forces in their own country. This meant that in order to mobilize was almost equivalent to a declaration of war, that no country could allow its opponent to give the original signal much before it gave its own signal, and that the decisions of politicians were necessarily subordinate to the decisions of generals. The alliance system worsened this situation in two ways. On the one hand, it meant that every local dispute was potentially a world war, because the signal to mobilize given anywhere in Europe would start the machines of war everywhere. On the other hand, it encouraged extremism because a country with allies would be bolder than a country with no allies, and because allies in the long run did not act to restrain one another, either because they feared that lukewarm support to an ally in his dispute would lead to an even cooler support from an ally in one's own dispute later, or because a restraining influence in an earlier dispute so weakened an alliance that it was necessary to give unrestrained support in a later dispute in order to save the alliance for the future. There can be little doubt that Russia gave excessive support to Serbia in a bad dispute in 1914 to compensate for the fact that she had let Serbia down in the Albanian disputes of 1913. Moreover, Germany gave Austria a large degree of support in 1914, although lacking sympathy with the issue itself, to compensate for the restraint which Germany had exercised on Austria during the Balkan Wars. The influence of democracy served to increase the tension of a crisis because elected politicians felt it necessary to pander to the most irrational and crass motivations of the electorate in order to ensure future election, and did this by playing on hatred and fear of powerful neighbors or on such appealing issues as territorial expansion, nationalistic pride, a place in the sun, outlets to the sea, and other real or imagined benefits. At the same time, the popular newspaper press, in order to sell papers, played on the same motives in issues, arousing their peoples, driving their own politicians to extremes, and alarming neighboring states to the point where they hurried to adopt similar kinds of action in the name of self-defense. Moreover, democracy made it impossible to examine international disputes on their merits, but instead transformed every petty argument into an affair of honor and national prestige, so that no dispute could be examined on its merits or settled as a simple compromise, because such a sensible approach would at once be hailed by one's democratic opposition as a loss of face and an unseemly compromise of exalted moral principles. The success of Bismarck's policy of blood and iron tended to justify the use of force and intimidation in international affairs, and to distort the role of diplomacy so that the old type of diplomacy began to disappear. Instead of a discussion between gentlemen to find a workable solution, diplomacy became an effort to show the opposition how strong one was in order to deter him from taking advantage of one's obvious weaknesses. Metternich's old definition, that a diplomat was a man who never permitted himself the pleasure of a triumph, became lost completely, although it was not until after 1930 that diplomacy became the practice of polishing one's guns in the presence of the enemy. The mood of desperation among politicians served to make international crises more acute in the period after 1904. This desperation came from most of the factors we have already discussed, especially the pressure of the mass army and the pressure of the newspaper reading electorate. But it was intensified by a number of other influences. Among these was the belief that war was inevitable. When an important politician, as, for example, Biancher, decided that war is inevitable, he acts as if it were inevitable, and this makes it inevitable. Another kind of desperation closely related to this is the feeling that war, now, is preferable to war later, since time is on the side of the enemy. Frenchmen, dreaming of the recovery of Alsace and Lorraine, looked at the growing power and population of Germany and felt that war would be better in 1914 than later. Germans, dreaming of a place in the sun, or fearing an Entente encirclement, looked at the Russian rearmament program and decided that they would have more hope of victory in 1914 than in 1917, when that rearmament program would be completed. Austria, as a dynastic state, had her own kind of desperation based on the belief that nationalistic agitation by the Slavs doomed her anyway if she did nothing, and that it would be better to die fighting than to disintegrate in peace. Lastly, the influence of imperialism served to make the crises of 1905 to 1914 more acute than those of an earlier period. This is a subject which has given rise to much controversy since 1914 and has, in its crudest form, been presented as the theory that war was a result of the machinations of, quote, international bankers, or of the international armaments merchants, or was an inevitable result of the fact that the European capitalist economic system had reached maturity. All these theories will be examined in another place, where it will be shown that they are, at worst, untrue, or, at best, incomplete. However, one fact seems to be beyond dispute. This is the fact that international economic competition was, in the period before 1914, requiring increasing political support. British gold and diamond miners in South Africa, German railroad builders in the Near East, French tin miners in the Southwest Pacific, American oil prospectors in Mexico, British oil prospectors in the Near East, even Serbian pork merchants in the Habsburg domains sought and expected to get political support from their home governments. It may be that things were always thus, but before 1914, the number of such foreign entrepreneurs was greater than ever, their demands more urgent, their own politicians more attentive, with the result that international relations were exasperated. It was in an atmosphere such as this that Vienna received news of the assassination of the heir to the Habsburg throne on June 28, 1914. The Austrians were convinced of the complicity of the Serbian government, although they had no real proof. We now know that high officials of the Serbian government knew of the plot and did little to prevent it. This lack of activity was not caused by the fact that Francis Ferdinand was unfriendly to the Slavs within the Habsburg Empire, but, on the contrary, by the fact that he was associated with plans to appease these Slavs by concessions toward political autonomy within the Habsburg domains, and had even considered a project for changing the dual monarchy of Austria and Hungary into a triple monarchy of Austrian, Hungarian, and Slav. This project was feared by the Serbs because, by preventing the disintegration of Austria-Hungary, it would force postponement of their dream of making Serbia the Prussia of the Balkans. The project was also regarded with distaste by the Hungarians, who had no desire for that demotion associated with a shift from being one of two to being one of three joint rulers. Within the Habsburg cabinet, there was considerable doubt as to what action to take toward Serbia. Hungary was reluctant to go to war for fear that a victory might lead to the annexation of more Serbs, thus accentuating the Slav problem within the empire and making the establishment of a triple monarchy more likely. Ultimately, they were reassured by the promise that no more Slavs would be annexed and that Serbia itself would, after its defeat, be compelled to stop its encouragement of Slav nationalist agitation within the empire and could, if necessary, be weakened by transfer of part of its territory to Bulgaria. On this irresponsible basis, Austria, having received a promise of support from Germany, sent a 48-hour ultimatum to Belgrade. This document, delivered on July 23rd, was far-reaching. It bound Serbia to suppress anti-Habsburg publications, societies, and teaching, to remove from Serbian official positions persons to be named later by Austria, to allow Habsburg officials to cooperate with Serbs inside Serbia in apprehending and trying those implicated in the Sarajevo plot, and to offer explanations of various anti-Austrian utterances by Serbian officials. Serbia, confident of Russian support, answered in a reply which was partly favorable, partly evasive, and in one particular at least, use of Austrian judges on Serbian tribunals, negative. Serbia mobilized before making her reply. Austria mobilized against her as soon as it was received and, on July 28th, declared war. The Russian Tsar, under severe pressure from his generals, issued retracted, modified, and reissued an order for general mobilization. Since the German military timetable for a two-front war provided that France must be defeated before Russian mobilization was completed, France and Germany both ordered mobilization on August 1st, and Germany declared war on Russia. As the German armies began to pour westward, Germany declared war on France, August 3rd, and Belgium, August 4th. Britain could not allow France to be defeated, and, in addition, was morally entangled by the military conversations of 1906 to 1914 and by the naval agreement of 1912. Moreover, the German challenge on the high seas in commercial activities throughout the world and in colonial activities in Africa could not go unanswered. On August 4th, Britain declared war on Germany, emphasizing the iniquity of her attack on Belgium, although in the cabinet meeting of July 29th, it had been agreed that such an attack would not legally obligate Britain to go to war. Although this issue was spread among the people and endless discussions ensued about Britain's obligation to defend Belgian neutrality under the Treaty of 1839, those who made the decision saw clearly that the real reason for war was that Britain could not allow Germany to defeat France.